The committee will be in order. I'd like to remind the audience that there is no audience participation in the hearing. All are welcome to spectate, but to follow the rules of decorum here in the hearing room. I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here today. And I would, without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. We welcome everyone to today's hearing on anti-Semitism on college campuses. And I will now recognize myself for an opening statement. I would like to thank our witnesses for being here today. Since Hamas's brutal attack on our friend and ally, Israel, on October 7th, we have witnessed a disturbing spike in anti-Semitic violence across our own country. This rampant anti-Semitism is perhaps most prevalent on American college campuses, often funded with billions in taxpayer dollars. Let's be clear, much of what we are seeing transpire on college campuses is not First Amendment protected speech. We are seeing pro-Hamas protesters commit vandalism, destroy university property, set up large encampments, and even in some instances, carry out acts of violence. At the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, protesters defaced a campus building hours before graduation, covering the university's steps in red paint. At Yale University, a Jewish student was surrounded by a mob of protesters and assaulted by a pro-Palestinian demonstrator. He used a Palestinian flag to jab her in the eye. At Columbia University, protesters barricaded themselves in Hamilton Hall, breaking windows and furniture and preventing other students from accessing the building. And I would note that Columbia canceled its main commencement ceremony. I would point out the young man that was asked if he was a Zionist at UCLA and then prohibited from moving to another part of the campus and in a building simply for expressing his view. Unconscionable. In fact, at the height of the protests on Columbia University's campus, one Columbia employee, an Orthodox rabbi, urged Jewish students to avoid campus, suggesting it was no longer safe to remain on university grounds in the face of ongoing protests. Now imagine that. In the United States of America, Jewish students were being told to avoid campus. And it is not just anti-Semitism on college campuses, it is also blatant anti-Americanism. The University of Pennsylvania, Ben Franklin statue is vandalized with the words, "Glory to the martyrs, Intifada until victory." At George Washington University, the statue of George Washington was spray painted with the words, "Genocidal Warmonger University." At the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, protesters replaced the American flag with the Palestinian flag. Unfortunately, the leadership of far too many of these universities has refused to respond with moral clarity as to what is happening. Instead, they've opted to cancel graduation ceremonies and in-person classes to avoid further disruptive demonstrations. The colleges that are failing to rein in these violent protests are actively trampling their Jewish students' civil rights. Keep in mind, these colleges receive billions in funding and subsidies from the federal government. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget estimates that President Biden's student debt cancellation, which constitutes a free handout to universities just as much as the borrower, could cost taxpayers up to $1.4 trillion. These colleges cannot have it both ways. They cannot rake in billions in federal dollars in subsidizing students to attend their universities while refusing to protect their Jewish students as they hide behind a false First Amendment argument. Congress has a duty to ensure that these federally funded entities are protecting students and upholding their rights. Thankfully, there are a few universities that have demonstrated strong leadership. University of Florida's President Ben Sasse made it clear that while students have a right to free speech, they do not have a right to take over an entire university, barricade themselves in campus buildings, and disrupt students' commencement. He rightfully stated, quote, "I want all of our students to feel safe. But more important than the subjective feeling, I want our students to be safe." And that is what is critically important here. In my home state, the University of Texas, President Jay Hartzell rightfully refused to let protesters set up an encampment and disrupt campus operations. You might ask, with Jewish students' rights under attack by students, agitators, and DEI bureaucrats, where is the Department of Justice and its crown jewel, the Civil Rights Division? Where is Assistant Attorney General Kristen Clark? Instead of taking meaningful action to uphold Jewish students' rights or going to the Columbia campus, like Speaker Mike Johnson did, the former chair of this subcommittee, to condemn the lawlessness, on Monday, Clark delivered Columbia Law School's commencement remarks, making no significant mention of the surge of anti-Semitic action on campus, and in fact, lumping it into a long train of items in his speech. Imagine that. Didn't even bring it up in any significance after Columbia had basically been sacked in protest. All while the Civil Rights Division, by the way, is actively trampling on the rights of pro-life Americans to peacefully protest by prosecuting them under the FACE Act. One young woman, a progressive activist, received a sentence of 57 months just this week. All while we haven't heard a word about what, if anything, her division intends to do about this anti-Semitic movement among secular liberals on campuses across this country. But beyond civil rights, Congress must also examine how we should use our power of the purse in Congress to shut off the flow of taxpayer dollars that are going to universities to fuel this radical ideology. We are allowing billions, I think $5 billion alone in FY23 that went to Ivy League institutions. Harvard is sitting on a $50 billion endowment. $50 billion endowment, most of which is tax-free. Penn, $20 billion endowment. Yet we continue to have taxpayer dollars flow to these universities while they are treating our Jewish brothers and sisters as we have seen unfold before our very eyes in recent weeks. The secular left wants to admonish us not to foment culture wars. The best way to do that is for these radical progressive Democrats that infest college campuses and leech off of the public dole and the public debt and the fat cat donors that fuel the endowments. Not to do just that, not to start the culture wars by attacking our Jewish brothers and sisters. I look forward to hearing from today's witnesses about their experiences with anti-Semitism on college campuses and how we can ensure the safety, security, and equal protection of rights. I now recognize the ranking member, the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Scanlon, for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for appearing today. As someone who represents a district with more than a dozen colleges and universities and many others nearby, it's particularly important to me that our campuses are spaces where students can engage in meaningful academic discourse while feeling safe and supported. Let's be clear, there is no place for violence, threats, intimidation, or harassment against students, faculty, or other school community members because they're Jewish. That kind of conduct is unlawful. It's not constitutionally protected speech, and it's antithetical to our most fundamental American values. That bigotry has no place in our society, and everyone deserves an equal opportunity for a safe learning environment, regardless of their race, ethnicity, gender, religion, or ancestry. That being said, we've seen too many times during this majority, this hearing seems to be part of a pattern of conduct in which our Republican colleagues appear once again eager to divide people, to exploit the issues that they think will score them the most political points. And in this very committee room, the Republican majority have at times decided it serves them best politically to actually defend threats or acts of violence, including those against public servants like election workers and school board officials. Every American should understand that political violence has no place in our country or in our political discourse. And everyone who purports to call themselves a leader must unequivocally condemn such calls to violence. That includes standing against acts of discrimination and hate in all of its forms. Similarly, I believe that those in positions of leadership have an obligation to model good behavior and not inflame passions around these issues, even when it might inure to their political benefit. So as we focus on fighting anti-Semitism on campus, we must also guard against reactions in the heat of the moment that threaten important principles like academic freedom and freedom of speech, considerations that I know the chairman and many other members of this committee on both sides of the aisle take very seriously. These principles are as fundamental to our democracy as anti-discrimination laws are central to the mission of our higher education institutions, and they are most threatened when the speech at issue is controversial. Schools, of course, are important places to help our young people become critical thinkers. That's because schools can and should expose students to the diversity of people, viewpoints, and experiences in the world around them. In fighting hate, Congress must respect the imperative that it not overreach and end up chilling constitutionally protected speech on college campuses or other places. That being said, there are concrete steps that Congress can take to combat anti-Semitism. As the chairman mentioned, Congress has the power of the purse. And if my Republican colleagues are serious about confronting this issue, they'd start by adequately funding the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights. That's the primary agency tasked with enforcing civil rights laws at colleges and universities. This includes enforcement of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination based on race, color, or national origin in federally funded programs, and which protects Jewish students from anti-Semitic discrimination. But when the Biden administration requested an increase in OCR's funding for FY 2024, House Republicans instead tried to cut the agency's funding by 25%. Ultimately, the final compromise deal left OCR's funding inadequately flat at a time when Title VI complaints from college students have risen sharply, and OCR lacks the resources it needs to get through an unprecedented backlog. And OCR's mission includes not just identifying violations of civil rights around anti-Semitism, but also implementing corrective action. So the failure to adequately fund impacts both the failure to identify past events as well as preventing future events. So as we look toward funding the government for 2025, the administration is once again requesting an increase for OCR. If our colleagues on the other side of the aisle are looking for a real, tangible way to fight anti-Semitism, they should provide that funding instead of once again trying to cut it. Similarly, if our Republican colleagues are looking for serious solutions, they'd help to implement President Biden's comprehensive national strategy to counter anti-Semitism. We could do so by passing the bipartisan and bicameral Countering Anti-Semitism Act of 2024, a bill that would, among other things, create a national coordinator to counter anti-Semitism in the Executive Office of the President to coordinate government-wide efforts to combat anti-Semitism. I should also add that while our Republican colleagues have called this hearing today, their record of condemning anti-Semitic speech and acts is far from perfect. Time and time again, they've failed to condemn instances of anti-Semitism, particularly when it comes from their right-wing allies, including the former president. Therefore, you'll have to pardon our skepticism about the rationale for holding multiple hearings to address this topic in multiple committees, when the focus appears to be actually stoking culture wars concerning institutions of higher education, rather than actually solving the problem and the scope of the problem of anti-Semitism on college campuses. We had a full committee hearing on this topic last fall, and other committees have held hearings on the topic as well. We know the concrete steps that Congress can take now to help counter anti-Semitism on campuses. The subcommittee's time would be better spent helping to ensure that we take those steps and empower OCR rather than pouring gasoline on the embers of hate and anti-Semitism that we are seeing around the country. Nonetheless, I thank our witnesses for being here, and I look forward to their testimony. I yield back.
I thank the ranking member, and I will now recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Jordan, for his opening statement.
I thank the chairman. Violent protests and encampments on college campuses, civil unrest throughout the country, a deeply unpopular Democrat president, and a Democrat convention happening in Chicago. Sounds like 1968, but it's 2024. Weeks after the October 7th terrorist attacks by Hamas on Israel, the Judiciary Committee held a hearing on the topic of anti-Semitism on college campuses. We examined the discrepancy between university administrators rapidly shutting down conservative events while posturing a slow reaction to violent pro-Hamas rallies and encampments throughout America's top institutions. School year continued with anti-Semitic and anti-American encampments lasting months. This even led to many graduation cancellations and disruptions. Imagine that. Go to class, you do your work, you paid your tuition, and your family and friends come to celebrate your achievements, and your school chooses to take the side of the woke mob. They've let infiltrate their grounds since this last October. It's been said that the activity on college campuses is like looking into a crystal ball 5 years into the future. Censorship of conservative ideas, speakers, and even students, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives being forced on peers, cancel culture, safe spaces. The list goes on and on. At this committee, our oversight is often done retrospectively. This hearing is an opportunity to look forward to ensure no other students have to go through what the brave witnesses today have had to endure. That is why we are here today. And I want to thank my colleagues, including Speaker Johnson, Conference Chairwoman Elise Stefanik, who have launched a house-wide investigation on this topic. In fact, this committee sent letters to Secretary Blinken, Secretary Mayorkas 3 weeks ago, asking a fundamental question. The Immigration Nationality Act says if a student is here on a visa and they're engaged in activity that is against the law, they're not supposed to be here. The visa is supposed to be taken away. So we asked Secretary Blinken, have you begun the process of revoking any visas? We know, for example, it's been reported in the press, 55% of the student body, according to the press, 55% of the student body at Columbia is here on a student visa or some kind of visa. Any of those people engaged in unlawful activity? If they are, Secretary Blinken, are you working to revoke that visa? And if that's happening, Secretary Mayorkas, are you looking to, or are you in the process of removing these folks from the country? I want Israel to win. They were attacked by a terrorist organization. I want them to win, and I thought the White House did too. I do not understand recent statements and actions by this administration when it comes to the weapons, not letting them go to our dearest and closest friend, the state of Israel. When it comes to the leading Democrat in the United States Senate telling Israel, we need a new prime minister, for goodness sake, this is our ally. I do not understand some of the things that are going on. That's why this hearing is so darn important. And I want to thank our chairman, Chairman Roy. I want to thank Virginia Fox for the work she's doing on the Education and Workforce Committee as well. And I want to thank our witnesses for coming here today to testify. This is important. This is real. I do not understand what this White House is doing. I do not understand. We want to help Israel prevail. That's what we should be focused on. And we want college campuses. We want college campuses where students can learn and get the education they paid for. With that, I yield back.
I thank the chairman, and I will now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Nadler, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I devoted much of my life to combating anti-Semitism, and I am as attuned as anyone to threats and bigotry aimed at Jewish people. I will take lectures from no one about the need for vigorous efforts to fight anti-Semitism on campus or anywhere else. I am also an unapologetic and deeply committed Zionist. But I believe, and I hope every member at the dais and each of our witnesses here today would agree, that criticism of Israel's government or political criticism of Zionism on a college campus is not inherently anti-Semitic. I also hope our witnesses and members agree that our democracy's commitment to free speech requires each of us to tolerate criticisms of even some of our most deeply held beliefs, especially in an academic setting where the freedom of inquiry is necessary to the teaching of critical thinking. That said, I am extremely disturbed by instances when political criticism of Zionism or of Israel does verge into anti-Semitism, such as when it is used as a proxy or a dog whistle for hatred of Jewish people. To the students appearing before us today, Mr. Jacoby and Mr. Kestenbaum, I'm sorry that you and your fellow Jewish students have endured threats, harassment, and intimidation simply for being who you are. That is completely unacceptable. I appreciate you being here today to share your experiences with us. Since the Judiciary Committee held a full committee hearing last November on free speech on campus, protests over the deaths of Palestinian civilians and the mounting humanitarian crisis in Gaza have increased, if not in number, then certainly in intensity. Much of the protesters' activity, even expressions that I consider disgusting and despicable, constitutes legally protected speech. Too often, however, the protests have exhibited vile anti-Semitic conduct, and the Department of Education will rightfully investigate them and their institution's response for unlawful discrimination. And there have been, of course, obvious examples of activities that are wholly unprotected, like threats and intimidation. Some students and protesters have even crossed the line into vandalism, destruction of private property, and willful disruption of campus life. They too should face disciplinary action by their institution, if not legal consequences for conduct that is obviously not protected by the First Amendment. There is no excuse for bigotry, threats, violence, or other criminal conduct directed at anyone, anywhere, and it is imperative that we confront the scourge of anti-Semitism. And Congress can help. But with respect, Mr. Chairman, we don't need more hearings. We need to take concrete action. We need to put our money where our mouth is. Last year, the Biden administration outlined a comprehensive national strategy to counter anti-Semitism, the cornerstone of which was increasing enforcement actions by the Office for Civil Rights at the Department of Education. OCR, as the ranking member of the subcommittee mentioned, is in charge of enforcing anti-discrimination, is in charge of enforcing Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, creed, national origin, anti-Semitism, etc. President Biden's budget called for a 27% increase in funding for that office, an increase made necessary by the huge increase in anti-Semitic incidents that we saw. If my Republican colleagues were serious about anti-Semitism, they would have fully funded that request. Instead, they bragged about proposing to slash funding by 25%. Slash funding for the office in charge of enforcing discrimination, of enforcing the laws against discrimination against Jews and others on campus. By 25%, they wanted to cut it, and ultimately insisted that funding be kept flat, despite the marked increase in Title VI complaints. We should also be considering H.R. 7921, the Countering Anti-Semitism Act, bipartisan legislation introduced by our colleagues Kathy Manning and Chris Smith, which would codify this national strategy's whole-of-government approach to confronting anti-Semitism. And we cannot stay silent when calling out anti-Semitism is inconvenient. I appreciate my Republican colleagues' concern for anti-Semitism on college campuses, but where were they when neo-Nazis in Charlottesville chanted that, quote, Jews will not replace us? Why did they not speak up when President Trump declared that there were, quote, very fine people on both sides of that rally? Or when he said that the Charlottesville rally was, quote, a little peanut, close quote, compared to ongoing campus protests regarding the Israel-Gaza war. And we hear nothing from our Republican colleagues when some conservatives repeat anti-Semitic tropes about George Soros or others. If you mean what you say here today, if you believe that the threats and vitriol that Jewish students face on college campuses is unjust, and that combating anti-Semitism is more than just a convenient talking point in a larger crusade against institutions of higher education, then it's time to move beyond hearings, pointless gestures, and posturing. We know what the problem is, and what we need is action that actually helps protect Jewish students. Fully fund the administration's efforts to counter anti-Semitism and other forms of discrimination by fully funding the requested increase in OCR to enforce Title VI. Pass the Countering Anti-Semitism Act. Our nation's students deserve no less. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Nadler. Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. We will now introduce today's witnesses. Mr. Eyal Yacobi. Mr. Yacobi is a senior at the University of Pennsylvania. He is one of 3 named students who filed a lawsuit against the University of Pennsylvania alleging violations of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. Mr. Shabbos Kestenbaum. Mr. Kestenbaum is a graduate student at Harvard University. He is one of the students who filed a lawsuit against Harvard alleging violations of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. Rabbi Dr. Mark Goldfeder. Rabbi Goldfeder is the director of the National Jewish Advocacy Center. He also serves as a presidentially appointed member of the United States Holocaust Memorial Council, general counsel to the Hillels of Georgia, and senior counsel at the Louis Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law. He has previously served as a senior lecturer at Emory University Law School and has written widely on anti-Semitism and the law. Mr. Kevin Racklin. Mr. Racklin is the Washington director of the Nexus Leadership Project. He previously served as the vice president of public affairs at J Street and as the United States director for the Alliance for Middle East Peace. We will begin by swearing you in. Would you please rise and raise your right hand? Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to give is true and correct, to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God. Let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Thank you. Please be seated. Please know that your written testimony will be entered into the record in its entirety. Accordingly, we ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. Mr. Jacoby, you may begin. And I'd ask everybody to remember to put your microphones on.
Thank you, Chairman Jordan, Ranking Member Nadler, as well as Subcommittee Ranking Member Scanlon, and Chairman Roy, as well as other members of this committee for inviting me to be here today. My name is Eyal Jacoby, a senior at the University of Pennsylvania. For 2 weeks, an unlawful and dangerous encampment was erected in the heart of Penn's campus. Bigotry, violence, and harassment have become part of Penn's daily syllabus. The encampment at Penn waved the flag of the PFLP while chanting, quote, "Al-Qassam make us proud." The PFLP being a designated terrorist organization and Al-Qassam being the armed wing of Hamas. While students walked to class, they were met with masked individuals screaming at them, quote, "Go die, you are Hitler's children and Nazis." One member of the encampment wore a sweatshirt with 2 rats surrounding a Jewish star. In another incident, a student walking on his own campus was surrounded by 4 masked figures, flashing strobe lights directly into his eyes. They proceeded to threaten him, saying, quote, "If you know what's good for you, you'll get out of here. Hope you have a good doctor, and how's your dental plan?" During a unity rally held by Jewish students, we chanted, "Rape is not resistance," while the encampment chanted, "Resistance is justified." When people reveal their beliefs, pay attention. Because at Columbia, they chanted, "Globalize the Intifada," right before smashing windows, barricading doors, and even taking a janitor hostage. For anyone wondering, that is what the start of a global intifada looks like. This is not just an issue for Jews. It is an issue for all Americans. Because on October 7th, Israel was physically attacked, but ideologically, every free country had been infiltrated. Because the same people who wave the flags of Hamas are burning the flag of the United States. I'm a firm believer in the First Amendment, but the vandalism, assault, and trespassing that is taking place across college campuses are conduct, not speech. More specifically, it is unlawful conduct. But at Penn, bigotry and violence seems to be permitted. Because within 24 hours of the encampment being assembled, Penn's administration released a statement and said in no uncertain terms, quote, "Blatant violations of university policies and credible reports of harassing and intimidating conduct have occurred." The president went on. He stated, quote, "Failure to disband the encampment immediately will result in sanctions." The encampment went nowhere. The following week, the president of Penn released another statement whereby he said, quote, "Every day the encampment exists, the campus is less safe. Some have aimed to characterize this as a peaceful protest. It is not," end quote. Despite this, he said that he still believes negotiations are the best way to go, while admitting that, quote, "the protesters have refused." What happened a mere 24 hours after this statement, you ask? The encampment took over the other side of Penn's College Green, chanted, "We don't want no Zionist pigs," and compared the Philadelphia Police Department to the KKK. They also vandalized the Benjamin Franklin statue with Nazi and Hamas logos, as well as graffiti reading, quote, "Zios get fucked." While the encampment persisted on an anonymous social media app exclusive to Penn students, posts read, quote, "Burn filthy Zio," and, quote, "Keep protesting louder. Hamas just made a statement, and they're with us." Penn, after 16 days, finally disbanded the encampment, declaring, quote, "Our community has been under threat for too long." The university finally acknowledged reality. We as students for far too long endured danger. So let me ask you this. What value is such an acknowledgement if action takes 2 weeks? The lesson that Penn has been teaching students and faculty is that violence and harassment work. Penn has allowed individuals to act with impunity. As former President Harry S. Truman stated, appeasement only makes the aggressor more aggressive. Moreover, 4 days prior to the encampment being disbanded, in Penn's own words, quote, "We have heard reports of circulating documents with instructions for escalating, including through building occupations and violence." The Penn crimes log even included, quote, "terroristic threats." To be clear, the university knew about documents circulating within the encampment for instructions on building occupations and violence. There were terroristic threats, and they waited at least 4 days to do something. On top of that, once the encampment was cleared, the university found weapons within it. This right here is the moral degradation of higher education and an utter neglect for safety. When we applied to Penn, we expected to be nervous about our final exams. What we didn't expect was to have counterterrorism units roaming on our campus. Taxpayers weren't aware that their federal dollars would support the hate that has taken root at Penn. But make no mistake, it is not the administration alone. Some professors at Penn are also abetting hateful speech and conduct. To illustrate, one professor posted a cartoon mocking 9/11. Another posted on October 7th, quote, "beautiful and timely," referencing Hamas terrorists entering Israel. While in class, a different professor remarked that not all Jews should be thrown into the sea, but only because, in his own words, it was not practical. I sit here today because I'm urging the administration to redeem themselves. Penn's coat of arms reads laws without morals are useless. Well, right now, Penn has laws with zero morals. Just last week, students put up 6 American flags on campus. Within 24 hours, all the flags were removed. Yet, the PFLP flag that sat just yards away was left untouched. Apparently, at Penn, the flags of terrorist organizations that rape, murder, and take American hostages can fly freely, but the US flag cannot. Thank you.
Subcommittee Chairman Roy, Subcommittee Ranking Member Scalman. My name is Shabbos Kestenbaum. I am a proud Jew. I am a proud first-generation American, and unfortunately, I have the distinction of being the plaintiff against Harvard University for their inability and unwillingness to combat Jew hatred on their campus. As my last name Kestenbaum suggests, my family's origins are traced to Germany. Indeed, my great-great-grandfather, Rav Yosef Breuer, was the leading German Orthodox rabbi and a respected figure within German society. Rav Breuer's youngest daughter, my great-great-aunt, vividly recalls praying from the Book of Psalms while her father was arrested by the Nazi Gestapo, and their historic Breuer synagogue in Frankfurt completely burnt to the ground on the night of Kristallnacht. As one of the very last Jews to flee Nazi persecution in Germany, my family found home in the United States of America, where they were able to rebuild and sustain their Jewish identity. To this day, the historic Breuer Shul stands tall in New York City, representing not only the indomitable spirit of the Jewish people, but of what makes the United States such a beautiful, welcoming country. My story of anti-Semitism, therefore, is deeply painful and it is deeply personal. Members, Kristallnacht did not begin with burning books or broken windows. Kristallnacht did not begin with destroyed synagogues nor expulsions. Kristallnacht began with the acceptance, the normalization, and the celebration of Jew hatred. Members of this committee, I appear before you with an urgent warning. The treatment of Jewish Americans on college campuses across this country, and in particular at Harvard University, is nothing short of a national emergency. It is blatantly anti-Semitic, it is frighteningly discriminatory, and it is deeply un-American. I say these words out of 2 years of personal experience with a pervasive bigotry towards Jews and a stunning lack of moral clarity. I'd like to walk you through the last 3 weeks at Harvard to prove my point. On the first day of Passover, hundreds of Harvard students and faculty members set up encampments in Harvard Yard in direct violation of Harvard policies, demanding that Harvard divest all monies from the Jewish state. The protesters cheered thunderously when they replaced the American flag overlooking Harvard with that of Palestine. They screamed about globalizing the Intifada, drew pictures of our Jewish university president with horns and a tail, and screamed at all hours of the day that, quote, Palestine will be Arab. Perhaps most concerning, the protesters established their own rule of law on campus, creating self-appointed safety marshals to patrol the campus. These safety marshals followed Jews, like me, on our way to class, monitoring our every move. They often recorded us and demanded that we leave their encampment as if we did not have a right to exist at Harvard. But they did nothing when their encampment participants physically threatened Harvard community members. This campaign was designed for one reason and one reason only: to intimidate, to harass, and to bully Jewish students at Harvard University. In fact, although President Alan Garber himself admitted that these students threatened both students and employees, the encampment was allowed to continue uninterrupted for nearly 3 weeks. While the encampment finally ended yesterday, if you would like to see Harvard's anti-Semitism in real time, look no further than the fact that Harvard has agreed with almost all of the encampment leaders' demands. In exchange for leaving, the anti-Semites will face 0 consequences. They will get to meet with the university to discuss a Palestinian studies department. They will meet with the corporation to discuss divesting from the Jewish state. And not once has Harvard publicly condemned the objective anti-Semitism that we Jewish students have faced as a result. Not once has Harvard's anti-Semitism task force said anything. More importantly, not once have they done anything to combat anti-Semitism at Harvard. The encampment espoused near daily anti-Semitism, harassed and followed Jews, called for the violent destruction of the Jewish state, all in direct violation of school policy. As a result, they will all be rewarded. Only those, I am a Jewish student and have thus far been unable to meet with President Alan Garber or my dean Marla Frederick or to discuss the pervasive anti-Semitism on campus. Only those who call for the ethnic genocide of Jews, violate school policy, and send masked thugs to follow Jews are given the honor of having a seat at the table. That is the reality of being a Jew at Harvard in 2024. While the anti-Semitic encampment was ongoing, a few brave patriots and I decided to plant 1,200 Israeli and American flags in memory of the 1,200 Muslim, Jews, and Christians slaughtered by October 7th. Harvard responded by calling the police on me. Harvard did not deem chanting violent destruction of the Jewish state actionable, but planting American flags were. Tellingly, within 24 hours of our installation being set up, the American flags, Israeli flags, and hostage posters were all vandalized. To this day, Harvard has yet to acknowledge, let alone condemn, this act of hatred. I will close by saying that Harvard students have called Jews bloodthirsty vipers. A professor has publicly stated that, quote, Zionists do not belong in public health. Class instructors have canceled classes to encourage students to participate in anti-Israel demonstrations. And a staff at Harvard threatened me with a machete. To this day, Harvard has yet acknowledged to me what they will do to protect me, what they have done to discipline this staff member. I have seldom experienced such disdain, disregard, and contempt for a minority group than the way in which Harvard treats its Jews at Harvard.
Thank you, Mr. Kestenbaum. Rabbi Dr. Goldfeder, you may begin your testimony.
Chairman Roy, Ranking Member Scanlon, members of the subcommittee, good afternoon. My name is Mark Goldfeder. I'm the director of the National Jewish Advocacy Center, a nonprofit legal organization set up to combat anti-Semitism. It is an honor to appear before you on this important topic. Even pre-October 7th, studies showed that nearly 75% of Jewish students on campus had experienced anti-Semitism. That number is only growing. I'm incredibly grateful for the wide bipartisan consensus, both here in Congress and in state legislatures throughout the country, that more needs to be done to protect our Jewish students. But anti-Semitism is also a serious concern for the rest of American society because history has repeatedly shown that it is the proverbial canary in the coal mine of intolerance. One need look no further than our college campuses, where already the chants have morphed from death to Israel to death to America. There's no time for a history of anti-Semitism, but it is worth noting that there are certain patterns that consistently emerge when it comes to anti-Semitism's focus, the form, if not the content of its justifications, and the effective process by which it allows otherwise decent people to do horrible things. In terms of its focus, as Chief Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks of blessed memory once explained, anti-Semitism often looks at Jews as a collective. The idea being that while individual Jews might be tolerable, Jews as a separate collective identity should not be allowed to exist with the same rights as other groups. That's why the majority of anti-Semitism in any given era tends to focus on the primary form of collective Jewish identity at that point in time. So in the Middle Ages, Jews were, for the most part, a religious community. And so they were hated for their religion, even if those particular Jews that were being oppressed were not religious. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the primary unifying collective identity of Jews was their ethnicity. And even when the assimilated Jews had only a trace amount of Jewish blood in them, they were killed. Today, when the primary collective embodiment of Jewish people on the world stage is the people of Israel and their nation state, Jews around the world are hated and held accountable for their state, even if they're not Israeli. The essence is the same, even if the focus shifts. It's the denial of the legitimacy of the Jews as a separate people. And in every generation, those manifested in such bigotry use some variant of the same refrain. We don't hate Jews, we just hate X. In order to justify their hatred in a socially acceptable way, anti-Semites need a rationale that can pass in polite society. So in the Middle Ages, that was religion. In post-Enlightenment Europe, it was science. And today, it involves actually abusing the language of human rights with selective claims of social justice that see only Jews or the Jewish state as worthy of condemnation. And finally, in terms of its insidious process, one unifying theme is consistent dehumanization. Whether the Jews are portrayed as malevolently superhuman, like in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, or as worthlessly subhuman. In Nazi ideology, anti-Semites have found that it is easier to despise and eventually kill that which you don't consider human. The bottom line is that the rationales are ever-changing, and so in order to fight anti-Semitism, we need solutions that can cut through all the timely excuses given for a timeless hatred. We need to focus on practical measures, and so I wish to offer 3 suggested efforts. First and foremost, for the vast majority of Jewish people across time and space, Zionism is and always has been an integral part of their Jewish identities. To quote my distinguished co-panelist, Mr. Racklin, not all anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, but most of it is. Certainly, any time that Jews are targeted for their Jewish belief in Zionism, that is anti-Semitism, nor is that in any way controversial or partisan. That idea actually comes from the administration's national strategy to counter anti-Semitism that Ranking Member Nadler referenced. And so Congress should clarify that unlawfully targeting a Jewish person for any aspect of their Jewish identity, including a belief in Zionism, is anti-Semitism and will be treated as such. Second, Congress should make sure that the federal government is enforcing laws already in place, including, of course, Title VI, and Congress could also add teeth in the form of penalties for schools that fail to fulfill their obligations or to follow the requirements to disclose foreign funding. And finally, Congress should make clear that the First Amendment is not some mystery that no one knows how to apply, and that the government expects universities to apply it correctly and consistently. Freedom of speech, even offensive and hateful speech, must be protected, but there are limits to what constitutes speech, and there are rules for when it crosses over into actionable conduct. Let me be clear. You can say whatever you want, however abhorrent, about Jews or the Jewish state, but you can't then attack Jews because of those hateful feelings. The First Amendment does not protect trespassing, vandalism, harassment, assault, the destruction of property. It does not protect those making true threats or intimidation or incitement. Protests are important, but schools can and must still impose reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions. Even a public university is not a public street, and the rules for what speech must be allowed on each are very different. University officials do not have to tolerate student activities that breach reasonable campus rules, that interrupt the educational process, or interfere with other students' right to receive an education. We also don't have to imagine what responsible leadership looks like in practice. As the chairman mentioned, President Ben Sasse at the University of Florida is one example of someone who has stepped up to show the way. Thank you for this opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
I thank you, Rabbi Goldfeder. And now I would turn to Mr. Racklin for his testimony.
Thank you so much, Chairman Roy and Ranking Member Scanlon. Thank you for inviting me here today. My name is Kevin Racklin, and I am the Washington Director of the Nexus Leadership Project, a group committed to supporting the historic U.S. national strategy to counter anti-Semitism and to fight anti-Semitism in ways that bring together communities. Anti-Semitism is a threat to our society and to the norms and values of democracy. Every day there seems to be new data showing an undeniable dramatic spike in anti-Semitism. That data doesn't tell the story half as well as these 2 students here today. As Rabbi Dr. Goldfeder explained in his testimony, the kind of incidents being reported go well beyond the bounds of mere expression or protest. Chants of F the Jews or calls for Jewish students to go back to Poland. These are brazen anti-Jewish taunts and harassment, and they should be condemned and are simply unacceptable. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a complex issue, and reasonable people can disagree on solutions. Universities should be a place to embrace complexity and promote understanding. But when students are celebrating October 7th or saying Zionists should die, this is simply unacceptable and should be condemned. There is some disagreement about where anti-Zionism and criticism of Israel overlaps into anti-Semitism. That's the debate the Nexus Project has engaged. But when it comes to action to protect college students, there is consensus around the anti-Jewish incidents we are hearing about today, and about one of the common ways that anti-Zionism shows up. While not every argument against Zionism as a political ideology may be motivated by anti-Jewish bias, as a practical matter, the majority of American Jews self-identify as Zionists. So when we have seen school clubs or movements with litmus tests saying Zionists not allowed, this is effectively a ban on including a majority of the Jewish students on that campus. That exclusion can be a Title VI violation, and civil rights laws give enforcement agencies a mandate to act against that discrimination. Ultimately, we have to recognize that the rise of anti-Semitism is a broader societal issue that extends far beyond just our college campuses. That is why the comprehensive whole-of-society approach of the national strategy is so critical. Its recommendations for how the government, schools, businesses, and communities can prevent and respond to anti-Semitism has bipartisan, bicameral support and has been embraced by the majority of the American Jewish community. The administration is already currently implementing the strategy within the relevant federal agencies. But what we have seen, again, is that politicians won't even take a look at it or accept it simply by virtue of the fact that it's from another party. As you hear in this room today, Jewish students are facing atrocious anti-Semitic hostility, and members of Congress should do something that might be extraordinary. Reach across any divide to take action. Too much of this debate and too many proposed solutions do nothing for Jewish students, American students, or the health of the higher education system here in the United States. A recent letter from Jewish students at Columbia noted, quote, "Over the past 6 months, many have spoken in our name. Some are politicians are looking to use our experiences to foment America's culture war." Another National Jewish Student petition said something similar. To truly protect Jews on campus and across the country, Congress must implement a collaborative and nuanced anti-Semitism strategy that centers Jewish safety above political gamemanship. Students are smart enough to know that the external public posturing and politicized debate is making more headlines than headway to improve their lives on campus. Politicians who are quick to descend on campus, call for presidents to be fired, or to hold press conferences have not done their core job to make sure students have a place to call for help. I hope that every member of the subcommittee supports 2 bills that are a priority for the vast majority of the Jewish community. I don't know what could be easier or more salient at this point in time. First, support the Goldman Showing Up for Students Act so that the Department of Education has the capacity it needs to cope with the influx of Title VI complaints. That office is handling a record number of anti-Semitism cases, but Congress hasn't even provided adequate support to cope with their pre-October 7th caseload, not to mention what has happened post-October 7th. 2, support the Manning-Smith Countering Anti-Semitism Act, a bipartisan, bicameral bill to establish a new national coordinator to oversee federal efforts to counter anti-Semitism and lead an interagency task force to implement the U.S. national strategy. This bill has broad American Jewish communal support from groups like the ADL, AJC, J Street, AIPAC, Nexus, Hillel, and JCPA, just to name a few. I hope this hearing spurs a few more members of Congress to co-sponsor and support these really critical bills in fulfilling a basic duty to protect these students at this critical point in time. Thank you so much for inviting me to testify today, and I really look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Racklin. And I will now recognize myself under the 5-minute rule for questions. Mr. Kestenbaum, you wrote on March 5th in Newsweek a fairly detailed outline of what you've been facing at Harvard. And I wanted to give you the opportunity to be able to express some of that, but let me just read for the record, then you can expand on it if you want, where you talked about being shocked to learn that Harvard permits the Palestine Solidarity Committee and other groups to hold an annual Israeli Apartheid Week funded with Harvard money, designed to fund student initiatives, as you laid out in the lawsuit. During these events, student activists were built what they called apartheid walls, meant to criticize Israel's efforts to prevent terrorist attacks, plastered Harvard Yard with imagery designed to compare Israel to the Nazis, and have invited more anti-Semitic speakers to infect Harvard's community. After that week, a swastika was found in the undergraduate Courier House, correct?
Yep.
Since October 7th, anti-Semitism on campus has multiplied exponentially. You wrote, "On my way to class," this is your words, "people directed chants at me to, quote, globalize the Intifada, to kill all Jews in the world, or to free Palestine from the river to the sea, to annihilate the only Jewish state and its Jewish inhabitants, including my family, your family." You might expect that, as you wrote, that Harvard Divinity School, with its mission emphasizing, quote, diversity, inclusion, and belonging, and with religious tolerance, the Divinity School, I want to be clear, one of its core tenets would be a safe place for Jews. As you wrote, Harvard Divinity, however, has, as my lawsuit alleges, proven to be a fount of anti-Jewish sentiment and discrimination. Does this reflect what you're currently finding in your experience at Harvard? And do you think it reflects the experience of most Jewish students currently at universities across the country, particularly Ivy League universities?
It absolutely reflects my experience, and I would actually argue it's only gotten worse. I'll give you one quick anecdote. Marla Frederick, who's the dean of Harvard Divinity School, who I'm sure is watching right now, I have emailed her more than 40 times to talk about anti-Semitism. She has not responded once to a single one of my emails. She's refused to meet with me. She's refused to acknowledge that anti-Semitism is a problem at Harvard Divinity School and at Harvard University more broadly. I'll make one last point. We invited 2 months ago a popular Israeli musician, Yishai Ribo, to come sing songs to Jewish students students who've been experiencing anti-Semitism. There was such a vicious boycott and protest where they chanted, globalize the Intifada, resistance is justified, that we had to hire outside security. When I asked Harvard DEI to, at minimum, condemn the fact that Harvard students have made it so unsafe for Jews to sing songs that we needed to have security, they said this does not fall under our purview. This is the same Harvard DEI that commented on George Floyd, on abortion, on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. When it comes to protecting Jewish students, nothing.
So, and to be clear, this is a Harvard that has a $50 billion endowment, correct? And is still getting billions of dollars of taxpayer funds. Correct. I just want to be very clear. When we're talking about the money and the need for resources, the problem here is the secular left in control of universities that are perpetuating the kind of stuff that you just described. And I just wondered, I want to investigate the point here to the extent to which this has been coordinated. The extent to which this is coordinated across campuses, across this university, across this country. Rabbi, I believe you're familiar with some of the observations and actually some information about the extent to which this has been very clearly organized and coordinated campus by campus around the country.
Sure, Chairman, somebody is buying all of those matching tents. And I believe strongly enough, that along with my partners at Greenberg, Traurig, Holtzman, Vogel, and the Schoen Law Firm, we filed a federal lawsuit in the Eastern District of Virginia accusing some of those coordinators of working directly with Hamas. And we'll let our filings speak for ourselves. I know that Congress is now looking into some of that funding, but it goes beyond funding. It goes beyond coordinating. When someone tells you that they are trying to provide material support to Hamas, it behooves us to believe them. And I'll tell you why I think it's so important to trace that funding. It's because if you ever walk into one of those protests, which I have done, you'll notice something fascinating. 80% of the people there don't know what river and what sea. Yep. Some are there for the pizza, some are there because they have been genuinely misled into thinking that they are on the right side of history. And if we can actually prove who's behind this, I think we can save 80% of our future citizens.
And on this point about the universities fomenting this, there are some universities that have not. There are some universities that have stood up. I would ask if you think there are some good examples. For example, my friend Ben Sass, the president of the University of Florida, who basically said, this is not a daycare. You know the rules. Follow the rules. And Florida then did it the right way. Or, for example, the University of Texas, where Jay Hartzell said, we're not going to do this. Would you guys agree that there is a way to do this at campuses? You can have free speech. You can be able to say what you believe, but not terrorize and harass Jewish students. Do you guys agree with that? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Last questions. I'm running out of time, particularly to the two students. Could you guys expand a little bit on the extent to which this is not just anti-Semitism, but anti-Americanism? I'm going to go to you first, Mr. Jacoby. I'd ask the two students to answer my question.
Definitely. I just want to reference one professor who, on a Twitter account, which criticized Sami al-Aryan, who was deported for terrorism, and it commented on how he visited a campus. A professor then retweeted it saying that this is the time to say that I have a long-standing respect for Sami al-Aryan. That is a terrorist that was deported from the United States, and a professor at Penn then said that she has a long-standing respect for him in response to that tweet.
Within 24 hours of installing 2 American flags at Harvard Divinity School, they were vandalized 3 separate times. The flagpole was ripped in half. The flags were tossed across the ground. This is not just about anti-Semitism, and it's not just about Jew hatred, but it's hating the United States. It's hating our democracy and hating Western values.
Thank you, Mr. Kestenbaum. I will now recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There's a whole lot of
Even when we talk about anti-Semitism, we can't even do it.
Thank you. Adios.
All right, Mr. Cohen, you may begin. We can restart the clock at 5 minutes.
Thank you, sir. What bothers me with this hearing, I think the hearing is good that we're having it on the issue, and I think the discussion's been great and the witnesses are great. But there's been anti-Semitism in this country and in the world for a long, long time. In the world, I guess 2,000 years, give or take, and in the United States, probably since the beginning of this country. And most of it has come from right-wing, racist crowds like the Ku Klux Klan, the Proud Boys, other groups that stand for nationalism. And they were the groups that were at Charlottesville and said, Jews will not replace us, and marched with their torches. They're the people that have consistently been the David Dukes and been anti-Semitic. And yet, when those things happened, people that are really against anti-Semitism, and those of us who are Jewish and feel it in a personal way so many times, didn't feel support from many, many, many people who today are some of the strongest people fighting anti-Semitism. Now, when they fight it, they are really fighting higher education. And they've always had a problem with that. I know a senator who said higher education is a cesspool. Well, obviously it's not, but that says something about her education. We ought to fight anti-Semitism in every quarter in which it exists. And what's happening now on the campuses is despicable and unfortunate. And so many of these people, including many of those who just left us and with their red hands and voices, don't understand the history of why Israel was created, why there's a necessity for Israel, and why it needs to exist. Ignorance has given them a lot of opportunity to make their voices heard. It needs to stop, but I think, and then what I'd ask Dr. Goldfeder, and I know you've been at Emory, I don't know, I think earlier, I don't think you're necessarily as Southern as that far back, but you get a taste of it in Atlanta. Is anti-Semitism more prevalent among Klansmen and Proud Boys and some of these right-wing groups?
I'm Emory by way of New York. But thank you for the question, Congressman. It's an excellent question. I'll answer that by saying that I think that anti-Semitism, it's hard to measure where it's more prevalent. It's dangerous wherever it comes from. But I think it is more dangerous coming from the left right now because it is okay to say it in polite society. No one thinks it's okay to say, I stand with David Duke or with the Klan. But people are willing to literally say, I stand with Hamas. And that's why it's more dangerous, because you can say it in polite society on university campuses.
Well, President Trump said he thought David Duke was okay when he ran for office in 2016, and he said he didn't know about all that other stuff, and he welcomed David Duke's support. But that's neither here nor there. A lot of the issues, and I don't mean to defend it in any way whatsoever, but has anybody out here, any one of you done any studies to see how much Saudi money or Kuwaiti money or Qatari money is been given to the schools, that Ivy schools in particular? I mean, dollars, I think, might have something to say, because I've read that there's a lot of Middle Eastern money gone into these universities and that they're afraid to lose it. Yes, sir, Rabbi?
I didn't do the study, but there was research done by the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy that found that from 2015 to 2020, institutions that accepted money from the Middle Eastern donors had, on average, 300% more anti-Semitic incidents than those institutions that did not. And from 2015 to 2020, institutions that accepted undisclosed funds from authoritarian donors had, on average, 250% more anti-Semitic incidents than those institutions that did not.
Anybody else have anything to add? Mr. Jacoby?
This was a report done by the Network Contagion Research Institute that invested Qatari money funneling into U.S. universities. The report clearly states, and I quote, "There has clearly been an erosion of democratic norms on campuses, and that a massive influx of foreign concealed donations to American institutions of higher learning, much of it from authoritarian regimes with notable support from Middle Eastern sources." That was the direct quote from the study.
And they generally are, those countries are generally aligned with Hamas.
I can tell you from my own experience, I'm a political science and modern Middle East studies major. I've yet to take a class in all 4 years of college that depicts the United States in any sort of positive light. And much of the professors that are saying things like playing the victim is what Jews are best at are the ones in the political science and modern Middle East studies department at Penn.
Well, I thank each of you. Both the students are very impressive, and the adults are super adults are very impressive too. And I appreciate the hearing, but I do hope that we'll have more consistency in our opposition to anti-Semitism. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank the gentleman from Tennessee. I'll now recognize my friend from Texas, Mr. Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You've probably been wondering why all of these pro-Palestinian anti-Semitic protests are occurring across the country today. Seems organic, right? Just some college kids protesting like it was back in the 60s and 70s. Same song, different verse. But is that true? We've seen this before, even more recently than you might think. In 2020, we had the Summer of Love and the organized, coordinated BLM and Antifa riots. In 2024, we had the organized and coordinated anti-Semitic protests and riots on college campuses around the country, like we're seeing right now. And what do these 2 years have in common? I know, they're both presidential election years. Sometimes I feel like Bill Murray on Groundhog Day. It's the same thing over and over and over again. Groups with similar ideologies and goals causing chaos and riots across my nation, and they've just picked a different cause this year. This year, it's my friends of Israel and my friends, the Jewish people. This isn't just some grassroots effort of college kids rallying around a joint cause, picketing the campus with signs and shouting, "From the river to the sea," for those who know what that means. These are people shouting anti-Semitic remarks, taking over and barricading themselves inside campus buildings, and in the case of Columbia University, taking a university employee hostage inside of a campus building. What are we seeing? What we're seeing now is not a simple protest. It's well-organized, violent occupation of campuses funded by outside organizations by their wealthy, liberal donors. And who are these wealthy donors? Don't shoot the messenger. I am not the one saying this. This is in Politico. We can all agree that Politico is a relatively trusted source, especially for the left. And according to a recent Politico article, some of the biggest donors behind these protests are George Soros, David Rockefeller Jr., and Nick and Susan Pritzker. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit to the record the article from Politico titled "Pro-Palestinian Protests Are Backed by Surprising Source, Biden's Biggest Donors." Interestingly enough, in his remarks about the campus protest, President Biden said, and I quote, "Destroying property is not a peaceful protest. It's against the law." But it seems like the president is talking out of both sides of his mouth, so which one is it? The protest wouldn't have happened in the first place without his donors funding it. But for you, President Biden, none of this would be happening at all. And remember, this isn't me saying this, Republican Wesley Hunt. This is Politico. You should have seen this coming. This is a presidential year after all, and I suspect that many of the protests that we've seen on college campuses may have just been recycled from 2020 riots and rioters and protests. And why do I suspect that? New York City officials said that close to 30% of the people arrested at Columbia and 60% of the people arrested in City College were not affiliated with the universities at all. In my home state, over half the people who were arrested at the University of Texas had no tie to the university at all. Mr. Kestenbaum, you brought up a very good point. You see, if you were black students, you wouldn't be sitting here, period. Because the entire campus would have changed their social media profiles to black dots, and these people would have been fired. These teachers would have been fired, and you would have your justice. And just because I'm black, I look different from you, doesn't mean that we get different treatment and we should be treated better than you because we're all Americans. I know we're all Americans because I fought for this country. I went to West Point. I fought beside my Jewish friends. I went to Cornell University for grad school. I learned beside my Jewish friends. And you should see the emails and text messages that I'm getting from my Jewish friends that I grew up with. I want to let you know that I have their back and I have your back. And just because you have a lighter skin color than me doesn't mean that you get to get treated differently than me, because we're all Americans and we all should be treated fairly in this country. No one should have it easier or more difficult to be able to walk around on campus based on the way we look. And if you are leaders on these campuses today, you're failing us. I went to Cornell for grad school, failure. Columbia, failure. Harvard, failure. Fix it right now. I want to let you all know that we, especially on this side of the dais, we have your back. We will fight anti-Semitism tooth and nail, and thank you for the courage and continue to fight for your people, and most importantly, continue to fight for our fellow Americans. God bless you. Thank you for being here. I yield back the rest of my time.
Thank you. Thank the gentleman from Texas. I will now recognize the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Escobar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to thank all of our witnesses for being here to testify. I know this is a really challenging moment in American history, and it's so important for us to listen to one another and learn from one another. I will tell you, I wish we could hear that same passion that we just heard about all racism. I sit on this committee, this subcommittee, and the immigration subcommittee, and I think it's really important for us to draw an interesting distinction that I have seen. From this committee, this committee actually has been used as a vehicle to promote xenophobia and to push anti-immigrant rhetoric in a way that has been incredibly alarming and disheartening. And again, I stand against anti-Semitism, as do the vast majority of Americans, I believe. I wish we could stand against all racism and all hatred together. And I think it's important for Americans who are watching at home to not necessarily listen to what my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are saying with regard to this issue, but really to look at their actions. They say they condemn anti-Semitism, and yet they fought to reduce funding for the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights by 25% last year. If we really are deeply committed as the United States Congress to combating anti-Semitism, then we should put our money where our mouth is and actually use the tools at our disposal and fund those tools. But when one side wants to cut those tools, it really makes you question what their real intention is. They say they condemn anti-Semitism, yet a good portion of them stood by silently in 2017 when white supremacists chanting explicitly anti-Semitic slogans marched in Charlottesville. And they said nothing when then President Donald Trump called those marching good people. They say they condemn anti-Semitism, yet they embrace the Great Replacement theory, a white supremacist belief that is rooted in both anti-immigrant and anti-Semitic sentiment, and it portrays immigrants and non-white Americans as invaders. In fact, the word invasion is probably the word most frequently used on this committee by my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. Here in Congress, as I said, our budgets reflect our values. I will continue to support and urge funding for offices like the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights so that our government has the tools it needs to really combat anti-Semitism. And I do believe students' rights to express their opinions or share their beliefs on campus should be protected, but students do deserve to be safe and learn in a safe environment. Mr. Rachlan, can you please tell us, do you think colleges and universities could help ratchet down the temperature on campuses and prevent violence by facilitating constructive dialogue and understanding among students with diverse backgrounds, students who are Jewish, Israeli, Muslim, Arab?
Thank you so much for that question, Congresswoman, and unequivocally, yes. This is something that can and should be done. Universities, college campuses, high schools, they need to meet students where they are, and they need to be able to bring them together in a safe and collaborative environment that fosters open and honest dialogue, but that is respectful dialogue at the same time. It can be upsetting, these conversations, for students on both sides of the aisle, but at the end of the day, this is how you actually bridge the sides together, through conversation that is respectful and meaningful. Having worked in the peace-building space, this is something that we push for quite consistently, the idea of sitting down with the other to see them as a human being and to actually have those conversations that are difficult and recognizing the shared humanity from the other side as well. And so I think it's absolutely critical that universities bring people together to have those conversations in a safe and effective environment.
Thank you for reminding us of those very important values, which we should not just pursue in a university setting, but those of us who are lawmakers as well. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady from Texas. I'll now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Kiley.
Mr. Kestenbaum, thank you for your very compelling and very disturbing testimony. I am so sorry for what you and your peers have had to endure, just the backwardness and the horror on Harvard's campus. I want to reiterate a very important point from your testimony, which is that Harvard caved to the demands of the encampment. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And tell us again how long the encampment was there.
About 3 weeks.
And you had the people in this encampment, I don't know if they were students or not, who were harassing Jewish students, who were threatening them, who were following them around and monitoring their activities. And in response to this, the university gave them what they wanted?
That's absolutely correct.
And what were the demands that were agreed to?
They want a full divestment from the only Jewish state. They want a Palestinian Studies Center, and they want to have full control over certain narratives that are being given in classrooms as it pertains to Israel.
And this was described as a negotiation. Were you invited to that negotiation?
I've never once been invited to speak with the president, with the dean, with anyone of power in Harvard.
So this is the important point. And you have these university presidents, and this has become a trend now, of university presidents caving to the demands of the encampments. And then they pat themselves on the back, they say, oh, the reasoned dialogue. That's how we got here. Dialogue is the answer. This is not dialogue. This is the opposite of dialogue. Dialogue involves a reasoned consideration of different points of view. Dialogue is not the preferred mode of operation for anti-Semites and anarchists and terrorists and their sympathizers because their arguments are terrible. They're morally bankrupt. They're repugnant. And so they prefer to do things by force. And now you have university administrations that are rewarding that mode of operation by saying the way that you get to be part of this negotiation is not by representing a significant voice on campus, not by someone who's been victimized by the things that are going on campus. Rather, the way that we will negotiate with you is if you engage in illegal activities and violate the university's rules and harass other students. And we're seeing this at more and more universities now. Just today, Sonoma State, which is a university in California, announced that they were, in response to the encampment there, basically adopting the full BDS program. They even said that for flyers that might be out there that made reference to study abroad in Israel, they would immediately act to get rid of those flyers so that the word Israel doesn't even appear on any of them. And then to top it all off, to enforce this new policy, they set up an advisory council of students for justice in Palestine. I'm not making this up. This is actually what they did. This council will enforce the agreement, and it's going to consist of members from the encampment, faculty, staff, administrators, Palestinian alumni, and other interested students. This is an absolute disgrace. Any leader at Sonoma State who is party to this needs to resign immediately. They're institutionalizing anti-Semitism. But I'll give you another example, because you said you haven't been invited to take part in negotiations, to have any sort of meeting with university leadership, and that's what we're seeing at universities across the country. Here's an example from University of California, San Diego, where a student emailed the chair of the Academic Senate and said, "Hope all is well. I've been invited to schedule a meeting with the Academic Senate regarding my experience as a Jewish and Israeli student on campus during this academic year. Please let me know the follow-up steps." The response, and this is from John Hildebrand, the chair of the Academic Senate at UCSD, says, "I apologize, but we can't meet with you at this time. There is a lot going on, and it's just not possible just now. Feel free to send comments to my email, but as you may imagine, we are inundated with requests." This is an absolutely shameful state of affairs, where you have the voice of Jewish American students that is being sidelined, the people who are most affected by what's going on our campuses, but the people who are creating the disruption, who are engaging in harassment, who are engaging in threats of violence, and even in some cases acts of violence, are being elevated, are being given a privileged position, and then are having their anti-Semitic, anti-Israel demands actually being agreed to by the administration. So this has become a much bigger problem than just the sort of scenes that we are seeing that are so disturbing that have been described by our witnesses today. It has become an institutional problem, the way that universities are responding to this. But of course, we know that it's the actions of the universities that in many ways have led to this crisis that we're now experiencing in the first place. So I want to thank, in particular, the students here from Harvard and from Penn, and so many voices that we've heard, courageous accounts from all across the country. We need fundamental reform in American higher education. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman from California. I now recognize the gentlelady from Vermont, Ms. Ballant.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This issue is deeply personal for me. I am the granddaughter of Leopold Ballant, who was horribly, viciously murdered in the Holocaust. When you go to Yad Vashem and you read the Book of Names, you'll see a lot of balance there. You don't see a lot of balance in this country. There's a lot of balance in that book. I've seen anti-Semitism firsthand. My family's experienced it. We are continuing to deal with the generational trauma that was brought upon my family through the Holocaust. I was raised in a house in which was taught at a very young age that you always need to look for the signs of anti-Semitism. It's used to manufacture division and fear, and anyone can fuel it, but it always benefits politicians who rely on that division and fear for their own power. It's incredibly frustrating to me that in Congress right now we can't have a conversation around anti-Semitism that will lead to actual action. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a video that I have compiled regarding anti-Semitism, and I ask unanimous consent to show it in committee.
You also had people that were very fine people on both sides. Any Jewish person that votes for Democrats hates their religion, they hate everything about Israel, and they should be ashamed of themselves.
Responsibility. Why do you use words like vermin and poisoning of the blood? The press, as you know, immediately reacts to that by saying, well, that's the kind of language that Hitler and Mussolini used.
Well, that's what they say. I didn't know that, but that's what they say. Because our country is being poisoned.
I think the FBI needs to be all over this. I think they need to look at the root causes and find out if some of this was funded by, I don't know, George Soros.
You know, we can look back in a time in history where people were told to wear a gold star, and they were definitely treated like second-class citizens, so much so that they were put in trains and taken to gas chambers in Nazi Germany. And this is exactly the type of abuse that Nancy Pelosi is talking about.
I stand by all of my statements. I said nothing wrong. And I think any rational Jewish person didn't like what happened in Nazi Germany, and any rational Jewish person doesn't like what's happening with overbearing mask mandates and overbearing vaccine policies.
Antifa's in the news because of a white supremacist rally in Charlottesville.
Well, isn't that interesting? That maybe that was created by the left.
Why do you say that?
Because let's look at the person that actually started the rally. It's come to our attention that this is a person from Occupy Wall Street that was an Obama sympathizer. So wait a minute, be careful on where you start taking these people to. And look at the background. George Soros is one of those people that actually helps, back these individuals. Who is he? I think he's from Hungary. I think he was Jewish, and I think he turned in his own people to the Nazis.
So you can see why I have a very hard time taking it seriously when we come together in this format, when I have to sit and listen to anti-Semitic rhetoric from my own colleagues. To the students, your experience is horrible, and you never should have had to go through that. I have family and friends who have students also at college campuses right now. Some are part of exercising their First Amendment rights against Israel. Some of them, like you, have been on the receiving end of horribly anti-Semitic rhetoric. Both these things are true. What I would like to see from my colleagues is to stop using anti-Semitism and your bogus attempts to address it to raise money and dollars. And why don't we do something that will actually solve the problem? Because it's real, and many people in this country are suffering from it. I yield back.
Now recognize the gentlelady from Wyoming, Ms. Hackman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually want to take a step back and look at the forces behind these college campus riots, which have far overstepped the protections from the First Amendment and threaten Jewish students and faculty across the nation. From what I have seen, these riots are a form of anarchy that are being pursued by a violent group of anti-American and anti-Semitic groups. What strikes me about this pro-Palestine, pro-Hamas inspired unrest is both the speed in which it started after the October 7th attack and the sophistication of the coordinated acts of crime, including threatening our Jewish students, occupying and damaging college buildings, and more. First, we must start with the fact that on October 8th, one day after the Hamas terrorist attack, Palestine chapters on college universities such as Harvard issued statements and began holding rallies in support of Hamas and placing the blame for the violence entirely on Israel. Mr. Kestenbaum, you are a master's student at Harvard. Didn't you find it a little odd that groups were so prepared to immediately support the Hamas attacks?
I found it odd and I found it horrifying.
Well, and I did too, and I would say this preparation suggests outside influence inside these student organizations, and that such outside groups were possibly informed of the October 7th attack before it occurred. That this situation is being driven by outside forces is not just speculation. Of the 262 people arrested at Columbia and the City College of New York, nearly half had no affiliation with the schools. At George Washington University here in DC, only 6 of the 33 arrested individuals were affiliated with the school. The coordination is mind-blowing. I don't want to diminish what our Jewish students are going through right now, but I want to hopefully highlight something, Mr. Kestenbaum, you stated in your testimony, and to describe the further danger of this situation. Wouldn't you all agree that outside criminal and violent forces exploiting colleges for their causes are dangerous for each and every member of the school, the students and the faculty alike? Mr. Jacobi, would you agree with that?
100%.
What about you, Mr. Kestenbaum?
Absolutely.
Rabbi Goldfeder?
Absolutely.
And Mr. Rockland?
Yes.
Shai Davidai, an assistant professor at Columbia Business School, reported that one of the nationwide instigators of these campus movements, Students for Justice for Palestine, received guidance and financial support from American Muslims for Palestine, and he reports AMP's directors have links to groups which fundraise for Hamas. These groups even have, these anti-Semitic, anti-American groups even have direct ties to the Biden administration, to the White House. The National Security Council Coordinator for Intelligence and Defense Policy and the Deputy Assistant to the President, Mayor Bitar, is driving the administration's Hamas policy. In college, Mr. Bitar was an active participant in Students for Justice in Palestine at Georgetown University. Again, that relationship, that connection, absolutely horrifies me, and I think it demonstrates why we have seen such a weak response from the Biden administration. Rabbi Goldfeder, your testimony touches on this issue a bit in your second recommendation, and what you state is that we just simply need to enforce the laws on the books which provide for punishment when foreign students provide support for terrorism. Could you please elaborate on the source of the issue from which this recommendation comes from and what Congress can do through oversight to ensure that the DOJ is doing just that, which is enforcing the law?
Sure. Well, that particular recommendation comes from the Immigration and Nationality Act, but I'll take it a step further, which is that even groups that include domestic citizens that support terror, there are laws in place. You know, the ATA and JASTA are there to protect everyone else from groups that support terror. AMP was founded on the ashes of other groups that were shut down literally for supporting Hamas. AMP coordinates NSJP, and that's why we sued them in federal court. And so I think it's important to enforce those laws to make sure that the DOJ actually does hold them accountable.
Do you think that the DOJ is currently enforcing the law as it is written?
I do not.
I would ask unanimous consent to introduce into the record the article, "One Look at Biden's Top Advisor Explains His Support for Hamas." I want to thank all of you for being here. I'm sorry for what you're going through, but I also want to thank you for your bravery, for your willingness to step up and talk about this. It needs to be exposed. Sunshine is the best disinfectant. We're going to get through this. We're all going to get through this. I know it's tough, but your bravery demonstrates that there are good Americans out there that will always fight for the right thing. Thank you. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady from Wyoming. Without objection, her consent request will be admitted in the record. I also have a letter from Advancing American Freedom to Attorney General Garland that without objection I'd like to introduce into the record involving these issues and some questions they asked of the Department of Education. And then in addition, I think somebody referenced earlier, I'd like to introduce a Politico article dated May 5th titled "Pro-Palestinian Protesters Are Backed by a Surprising Source. Biden's Biggest Donors, Including Soros, Rockefeller, and Pritzker." Without objection. And now with that, I will recognize the ranking member.
Thank you. I do think we're hearing an interesting array of conspiracy theories here without much evidence to back them up. I mean, that could be a subject of a whole nother hearing, including the growing evidence that Russia, China, and Iran are exploiting the campus protests for their own purposes to sow division in the U.S., particularly in advance of an election, as we've seen them do the last 2 election cycles. So that probably is not the right subject for today's hearing, but it does go to one of the issues I'm most interested in, which is the role that our schools, our colleges, our universities can play in terms of educating students and young people how to distinguish fact from fiction, propaganda from what's true in the world, and how they can help us, everybody, but particularly on our college campuses, provide the atmosphere, the respect for one another, the ability for people to have those open conversations, and we've seen a variety of responses. I know today's focus has been upon places where there has been virulent anti-Semitism and hate speech and actual potentially criminal violations. But there are many campuses where this has not occurred, and there have been great efforts. So, Mr. Rockland, could you comment upon the role that colleges and universities can play, what they can do perhaps in combination with the Office of Civil Rights to make sure we do have safe spaces for people to discuss these important issues without veering into territory that we don't want them to?
I'm really glad you brought that up, and I'm very happy you brought up the Office for Civil Rights, and I think it's an important thing to note in this committee that hasn't been said yet is this. I'm just going to say a quick number, 50 to 1. This is the number of investigations per investigator that the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights have currently for their caseloads. 50 investigations per investigator. Each one is trying their best to try to investigate all of these complaints of Title VI on college campuses and in high schools around the country. They don't have the resources to adequately address this. They need more money. It's one of the reasons why we and others are really pushing for increased funding for OCR to really push that forward, to give them the resources to take some of the pressure off the university so that when there are complaints like the students here, that they are being investigated quickly, that they're being brought to fruition, and that there are consequences following those investigations that the department is actually putting forward. In terms of universities, they really need to do a better job at bringing people together. One of the things I've seen is that there are several universities that, rather than allow these encampments and these issues to bubble up and explode the way they have on other campuses around the country, that they've brought together sides before any of this has happened, sat them down and said, these are the rules for engagement, these are the rules for protest. If you go outside these lines, you will be subject to be penalized for that. And I think that is the way that universities should be handling this. They should be taking a proactive approach rather than a reactive approach to this at this point in time. And I think all universities, particularly someone like my alma mater, Ohio State, this is what they are trying to do at this point in time. They're trying to be a proactive and address this before it starts spilling out so that it impacts Jewish students across their campuses.
I do think that's a really interesting role, particularly in the academic context of helping people to understand what are the boundaries of free speech versus hate speech, what are the boundaries of nonviolent protest and civil disobedience, so people understand where they are, and if they do cross those lines, they do so intentionally, and then they know what the consequences are. Do you want to add anything, Rabbi? You looked like you were nodding in
No,
agreement.
I agree with everything that was said, but I'm also a practical thinker. And when you look on Canvas, we're not seeing calls for conversation. You know, hard conversations are like chess, and you can't play chess when someone keeps on knocking over the board and kicking you in the face. So until we can assert these are the rules of the game and how we're going to have conversations, and again, I'll point to Ben Sasse in Florida, President Ben Sasse, he's done that, then I'm all for it. But you have to have a conversation with someone who respects your very existence, or else it won't go anywhere. So I 100% agree in theory. And when it comes to funding OCR, absolutely we should give them the funding that they need. But there also does need to be accountability. I've done OCR complaints for many years, and to my knowledge, there's never been in history a single time where a university actually lost its funding for anti-Semitism. The words have to mean something. So I think any additional funding has to come with accountability.
Sure, and that makes sense, and it would help if OCR had the resources it needs to do its job. I do have to disagree that the only response has to be, threats, because we've certainly seen at many of the universities in my district that having open dialogue, having respectful dialogue has avoided some of the issues that we've seen and that have been discussed today. So thank you. With that, I yield back.
Thank the ranking member. I will now represent my good friend, Mr. Armstrong.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we should start with, this isn't a protest. What we saw in here today is, and it's performative art. The only time their hands go up is when the camera goes up, because they're trying to get in a picture. And they can't keep their hands up for longer than 15 seconds. If they want to know what protest and bravery looks like, read some stories. Talk about somebody starving to death and handing the person standing next to them in line their food for the day, when the food they're getting for a day is less than most people get for half of a breakfast. When an entire continent is trying to wipe you off the face of the planet. And you want to know what the difference is? Mr. Kestenbaum, if the Klan tried to have a 2-week sit-in protest at Harvard, do you think Harvard's university and their leadership would negotiate a ceasefire with them?
Yeah, absolutely not.
Mr. Jacoby, if a bunch of militia guys showed up in Tommy tactical gear and playing G.I. Joe and doing all of those things and wanted to do all of that at Pennsylvania, you think the university would negotiate with them?
They would not.
No, they wouldn't. Mr. Goldfeder, you said that. That's the difference. Because you can get a picture with these people, you can stand there, you can talk about these things in polite society when they are saying things when they have no idea what the history is. 7 miles from the river to the sea. 7 miles to the Jordanian border. That's where it is in Israel. The reason Israel exists is because nobody in Europe would take them. We wouldn't take them. It is the greatest single horrific event in modern history. And I just think if you're at Harvard, maybe you should learn about it. Or if you're at Penn, you should learn about it. So when we talk about these things like they're equivalent, they're not. They're just not. This is coordinated. This is going on. We treat somebody different. Here's the thing. If somebody comes after you with a machete, that's not a mostly peaceful protest. That's a felony. Charge them. If you want to occupy an entire building and commit felony acts of vandalism, how about a bunch of rich, liberal credit card kids understand what the consequences to a protest are? Spent 10 years as a criminal defense attorney and a public defender. I could tell you, if you are not on an Ivy League campus and you decide to do that when you're told you're going to leave, you know what you are? 6 months later, you're a felon. We don't need more federal money and dialogue. We need somebody to say, hey, we're going to, you want to do this? You want to go on the grounds of free speech? You want to commit crimes on public ground? Then you know what? You can go through the rest of your life with your Ivy League education. Great, fantastic, it's awesome. But you're also going to have that felony designation. Let me know how that goes when you're trying to become a licensed doctor or a licensed nurse. And then better yet, I think we should give them a Columbia Law School graduate as their attorney. Because you know what they got? Pass-fail grades, because who could possibly go to law school at a time like this? You know, the one profession where your personal feelings and your independent emotions and your spaces don't matter. I'm sorry, Judge, I need a continuance. Why? You overruled my objection, and I don't know how we could go on at a time like this. I have no concept. This is not the same thing. This is pervasive. It has been allowed to exist. And I just had 3 seniors in high school here, not from North Dakota. Turns out I don't have a very large Jewish constituency in North Dakota. We're pretty homogeneous up there. But there is no moral equivalency to any of this. And when we pretend that there is, and we paint our hands red, and we walk around here, the reason the Klan wore hoods was two reasons. One, to intimidate people. The other reason is because they didn't want anybody to know who they were. That's the difference. I've got a minute left, and Mr. Kestenbaum, you go back to your neighborhood right now, where you went to high school. Would you tell a senior in high school who's a Jewish senior in high school to go to Harvard?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. I want to be super clear with my former principal and my Jewish community that it's not that Jewish students don't feel safe at Harvard. Jewish students are not safe at Harvard. And until Harvard implements any type of accountability, responsibility, or policies to combat anti-Semitism, then all of these Jewish schools and synagogues and communities should not allow Harvard admission recruiters within 50 feet of their school or 50 feet of their child. It is completely unacceptable what Jews are facing at Harvard in 2024 in the United States of America.
Mr. Jacoby, same question for Penn.
I agree with my friend Shabbos. Unless the university enforces their own rules between now and graduation, then no Jewish student, no one that doesn't support the pro-terror encampments that are happening should step foot on Penn's campus.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman from North Dakota. I now recognize the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses for being here today, what you've testified to. We've heard this not only here in Congress, but in our communities back home, and I myself just came back from Israel, where there is a deep-seated fear that there is a separation between Israel and the United States because of the policies of this administration. According to Hillel International, there have been 1,584 total reported anti-Semitic incidents on college campuses since October 7th. Since October 7th. That's a 700% increase compared to just last year. At 65 institutions of higher education have been placed under investigation since October 7th of last year. 65. Mr. Chairman, I request unanimous consent to enter into the record the statistics from Hillel International.
Without objection.
So let's take a look at these statistics in action. Let's play a video.
Video shows protesters stacking those barricades and then planting a Palestinian flag in them.
So these clips are just a snippet of the nonsense that we have seen on college campuses since October 7th. This isn't in Gaza. This isn't in the West Bank. This is right here in our country. Institutions of higher education, which are supposed to be great institutions of learning where you develop as an individual, are now places of repression and suppression, depending on who you are. The last photo, George Washington visualized dressed up, I think is one of the most important things that I've seen. That's right here in our nation's capital. It's heartbreaking to see that, and I'm not Jewish, but I empathize with what you two have gone through in your classmates, and not only at your schools, but in dozens of schools across the country. Mr. Kestenbaum, just yesterday, protesters at Harvard finally took down their tents as the university officials agreed to the students to discuss the questions about the university's endowment. Have Harvard officials publicly condemned anti-Semitism that Jewish students have faced on campus in any which way?
As it pertains to the encampments, Harvard, forget about, hasn't condemned the anti-Semitism from the encampments. They haven't even acknowledged that it happened.
Do you feel that Jewish students at Harvard have an ally and an advocate in the administration
In no uncertain terms, let me be absolutely clear. Jewish students do not have a single advocate at Harvard University. The president doesn't meet with us or care about us. Our respective deans don't meet with us or care about us. We have students who have seen that there is no responsibility or accountability for their actions. So they can chant, globalize the Intifada. They can chant calls for the ethnic genocide of Jewish people. They can draw our Jewish university president as a devil because they know they will get away with it. It is inconceivable that any other minority group in the United States would be treated with the scorn and contempt and disregard that Harvard treats its Jewish student population. And let me just add, it is a damning indictment that in order for Jewish students at Harvard to receive equity, equality, or justice, we have to go to a court of law, we have to go to the United States Congress, we have to go to the media, because the people at Harvard, who again, I'm sure are watching this, they won't even talk to us.
Yeah, isn't that absurd, right? Like you're followed on a college campus, you can't go to school. In some universities, they're canceling commencement. I mean, y'all are the generation that couldn't go to your own commencement for high school because of COVID, and now these radical lunatics are taking over a college campus, and we can't ensure the security of our own students, so we're going to cancel things. And then we adhere and acquiesce to the demands of this lunatic fringe. It just doesn't, it makes no sense to me. Mr. Jacoby, earlier this month, you delivered a petition to shut down the encampments. I think you got 3,200 signatures. You delivered it to the president, the provost, and the board of trustees. You did not receive a timely response, so you sent a letter. I think it was in an email, and you laid out a few demands. Can you elaborate what those were, really briefly?
Thank you for the question, Representative Fry. The demands were actually exactly what the president stated within 24 hours of the encampment, is disbanding an encampment, which is allowing violence, pro-terrorism support to happen. We got 3,300 signatures on that petition. And then after a week, when we hadn't heard a response, we sent another petition where we got 2,800 signatures within 24 hours, both of which were not responded to. And yet the administration had 3 meetings with the encampment.
And in my last question here, do you believe, both of you, do you believe that your universities are doing enough to prevent anti-Semitism on college campuses? That's an obvious answer, I think. But
I wouldn't say that they're not doing enough. They're not doing anything.
Mr. Jacoby?
It's almost a satirical question with how little they're doing.
Thank you so much. Appreciate your time, your bravery today to be here. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, gentleman of South Carolina. I recognize the gentlelady for a UC request.
Yeah, I request unanimous consent to enter into the record an article from the front page of the New York Times, Sunday, May 11th, describing how the Republican Party has seized on-campus protests as a political tool. It's entitled, How Republicans Echo Anti-Semitic Tropes Despite Declaring Support for Israel.
Without objection.
Thank you.
Well, this concludes today's hearing. We thank the witnesses for appearing before the committee today. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witnesses or additional materials for the record. Without objection, the hearing is adjourned.